I was trying to remember when I first met Jack Putz, and I remember when I first met Jack Putz. You were wearing something similar to what you're wearing
Probably
right now,
the same
but
thing.
it was a t-shirt. Yeah, he may not have even changed since that. But it was either 1983 or 1985. And
I was in middle
in,
school at the time.
Yeah, and I was in kindergarten. But, I was doing my graduate research, my PhD research at the La Selva Biological Station in Costa Rica. And Jack was, this really famous botanist, Liana ecologist, whatever. And we were all just dying to see Jack Putz arrive with the course to La Selva. And I remember being outside of the old lab and you walking up in like what he's wearing today. And that was a long time ago. And Jack's been a lot of places since then. And you must have, when did you get to Florida?
82.
82. So it was right after he got to Florida.
Yeah.
And he's going to tell us a little bit about his story and since then, or at least.
I'm going to try and tell you a little of my story, but I'm really going to do this as a retrospective because for the last year, I had the most amazing job. I was given a fellowship called a Jefferson Fellowship from the National Academy to go to Washington, and they stick senior faculty in some government department, the State Department, USAID. And I was stuck in USAID, and my job was to figure out why my efforts over the last 40 years at tropical forest conservation have failed. Which is an alarming job. They weren't particularly interested in my failure, but they were interested in their own failure, the fact that they had invested close to $1 billion in tropical forest conservation, and they wanted to stop wasting their money. They wanted to be more effective. And so rather than being a university professor, which I've been doing for a long time, where I can come to classes like this, talk to students and faculty, and teach classes and do other things. That was every day I got up and my job was to figure out what was wrong. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that. And if this seems half-baked, that expression, it's because it is, because I'm still struggling with this. I'm trying to put my work in context and try and figure out what has worked and what hasn't so I can build on what's worked and try and scale it up. And one of the things I'm trying to do is figure out, in my own case, where I am and where I should be. And so I've come up with this kind of preliminary taxonomy of environmentalists or conservationists or whatever that stretches from activists through policy people over to researchers. And then, among the activists are the pushers of the real shouters, Environmental Investigation Authority and Greenpeace to some extent, and then the pullers, the people who write children's books and do photographic books and try and win the hearts of people for conservation. Among the researchers, there's often this dichotomy between the basic researchers who are doing curiosity-driven research and the applied researchers who are trying to solve problems. And then there are people, the policy people, a lot of environmentalists go the policy route. Often after they get research degrees, then they get involved in policy. And those policies can be hard or soft. They can be national or international. And as a university professor and a researcher, I've been most of my time over here, although I do write things, children's books and novels and things like that, trying to pull. And I do research. I'm an applied researcher mostly, although about 20% of my time is just, I'm doing research because it's really interesting. Whatever it is that I'm studying gets me excited. And I think that's okay because I spend most of my time trying to solve problems. And actually, my approach is to do research that informs policy. But I'll get back to that in a minute, with the hope that the policy will result in conservation, which hasn't happened. Sorry, but I'll get to that. So there are some assumptions that I go about in the world, and these assumptions I have to question, as we have to question all of our assumptions, like science matters and truth wins out. I mean, if you're watching the news in this country, a lot of other countries to a lesser extent, I think these are questionable assumptions that people care about each other and they care about international equity, future generations. They don't seem to act that way. And they care about other species. I do. I'm motivated by concern about other species. I'm one of those people that believes that other species have a standing. They have rights. Intrinsic values. But I have not acted on that particularly. That's what gets me up in the morning, this faith-based initiative that nature is of its own, has a value of its own, but instead I've gone for interventions that are market-based, because early on back in the 80s, I realized that what was happening to tropical forests was driven by the profit motive. So if the market forces that were destroying forests could be co-opted in some way to conserve forests, and my forest conservation is conservation, not preservation. I'm basically a forester. I work in forests that are managed for timber and non-timber forest products. So we invest in various kinds of inputs to promote conservation, policy reform, and monitoring, all these things that you've been talking about. You were talking about today, the monitoring, the importance of that, and evaluation, impact evaluation, and capacity building. So I've been involved in all these, and then the whole series of interventions that we keep trying, and they all work in some places, under some conditions, and for some people. Now, that's something that we need to be clear about. You can say that this forest has not been destroyed, but there were people who benefited from that and people who didn't benefit from that. It actually cost. So my primary work has been on what's called reduced impact logging, and it's on ways of getting timber out of forests so that the forest value is not greatly diminished. So protecting water courses and biodiversity and carbon stocks and so forth. Back in the 80s, I started with forest certification, the idea of market premiums for timber products, forest products harvested from forests that are well managed. It's a good idea. It does work in some places, but it mostly doesn't work. I also started working back then in the early 90s on carbon offsets and pushed for, in my first big international policy effort, also was a failure because of the damn Brazilians and WWF. I was pushing for standing forests in the Kyoto Protocol. So, and the Brazilians came back and said, no, sovereignty, as you always do, justifiably. And WWF said, well, we don't want tropical forests being held hostage. So the idea of RED we had proposed back in the early 90s, but it died, didn't quite die. It simmered along. We had a carbon offset project, that's what they used to be called, and it continued. And now RED, reduced emissions from deforestation and forest degradation, about which Talis will undoubtedly talk, is continuing. Again, not having as not a silver bullet, and none of these are silver bullets. That's clear. Also working with payments for ecosystem services and less so with community-based forest management, but any kind of forest management, trying to make a living from forests or making an income from forests while keeping the forest standing. And then more and more participatory approaches to conservation. And what the hope was that all of these would lead to both development and conservation. And the model that I have in the back of my head is that this is a model from economics, and most of you have probably seen this already. It's the idea of a production possibility frontier, that there are trade-offs between, in this case, short-term benefits and sustained benefits. But there's a surface that describes the best possible trade-off. I mean, you can get lots of short-term benefits, but then no sustained benefits. Or you can sustain your benefits, but your short-term benefits are going to be small. And, okay, where we are on the production possibility frontier is something that society should decide. But when you're inside the production possibility frontier, you're not getting as much of either as you should. So that's a model that motivates me. I want to go from this current condition out to the production possibility frontier. And I'll leave it to the society to decide where you want to be, but I don't want to be here. And so I'm presenting these models because I find them useful in organizing my thinking, and maybe you will as well. So this model also has been useful to me because in, I think it was 1984, there was this, I was a young faculty member. I was trained in ecology and botany, and I worked on liana ecology, but I was always working with forestry departments. So I had these ideas. And I was invited by this rather annoying, well, aren't they all, social scientist to talk about the broader picture of conservation involving all these people. Oh my God, I know a lot about trees and vines and roots and things like that, but I don't want to have to think about relationships and connections. Oh my God, give me a break. And the idea of mental models and how they are shifting what people do. Come on, I have papers to write. Leave me alone, will you? She's still pestering me. But what I was doing was working up here in trying to do research that informed policies, and rather disregarding all this. And to my detriment, I mean, or the detriment of the efforts that I was working on, because this is a site of one of my permanent sample plots in a permanent forest estate that didn't turn out to be very permanent, as you can tell. Instead, it got planted in oil palm. I do a lot of my work in Southeast Asia, but this is what the Amazon is going to look like once people realize that you can make way more money from oil palm than you can from cattle and soybeans. And it's a fantastic crop. It's 9 times more productive than any other oil crop. And so I'm working in areas, I work a lot in Southeast Asia where oil palm has already reached the horizons, but it's happening in Latin America as well, and in parts of Africa. But I'm battling for forest conservation through sustainable use of timber and non-timber forest products and ecotourism and carbon sequestration and hydrological payments for other ecosystem services and so forth. But I was finally working with an Indonesian economist, and I couldn't understand, I had trouble understanding why these local government officials were pushing for forest conversion to oil palm plantations when, you know, all these benefits they could have from the natural forest. And he said, if I told you that oil palm plantations were 5 times more profitable than managing a natural forest for timber and non-timber forest products and carbon payments and other payments for ecosystem services, you'd understand why the government officials are pushing for oil. I said, yeah. He said, well, oil palm isn't 5 times more profitable than forestry. It's 50 times more profitable than forestry, which just made me, I went to that. I mean, what else are you going to do? I mean, this is what we're up against. And I'm afraid that a lot of environmentalists aren't realizing just how bleak the economic, short-term economic situation is. And with more and more people becoming urban, and what is this? More than 50% of the population of the Amazon is now urban, or kind of weird urbanism, but urban, not out there every day. They're not thinking about these other options and the other benefits. And I think one of the problems is that I've been led astray by this von Thunen model. This, I hope you've seen before. It's a simple model that is on the x-axis is some kind of distance or accessibility. With increasing distance, out to the right. And then on the y-axis is some kind of intensification or financial profits and so forth. And what's plotted here is and this is typical of von Thunen models, and this is used to explain the forest transition theory and so forth. And I use this all the time, although it's wrong, I realize, is that when you get far from markets, your land tenure becomes less secure. The land is probably not as good because it's not very accessible. And human density, population goes down. And your profits go down because transport costs are high. So if you're close to a market, you can make a lot of money on agriculture. And you can also make money on forestry, harvesting timber, but it's much less. And the reason I said this model is wrong is that there should be a break in the axis here, and that should be 50 times higher. And I think that's where I've been misled by this. So I'm sort of laying out my dirty laundry here so you can see you don't make this, maybe don't make some of the same mistakes. There have been some hard truths that I've had to learn or accept. And so the first is that the opportunity costs of retaining forests are huge. You can usually make a lot more money from converting forest or Cerrado, savanna to something else than carefully harvesting from the intact ecosystem. Okay, and no one's paying for all these carbon benefits. The sky money's not falling. I mean, we continue to talk about it, and it's a really interesting intervention. Ecosystem service payments, that's not happening other than small pilot scales. And where it works great, but most of the time it doesn't work. We're just finishing an analysis now on the Atlantic forest in Brazil, where there's been a payment for ecosystem service programs. And it's been quite effective. It's been going on 10 years. And 347 hectares of forest have regenerated at a cost of $19,000 per hectare. Yikes. I wouldn't call that a success. That's pretty bleak. It's hard to make it work. The other one is that it varies the proportions of the forest loss that's due to smallholders, but a bunch of it is in a lot of places. And it may be short term, and the smallholders, I mean, poor people lose out one way or another. You know, they may do the deforestation and then the land gets consolidated into bigger holdings. And but this is important because of equity issues that loom large. Because in most of the interventions that we try, even if poor people benefit, rich people benefit more. So inequity gets exacerbated. And that's something that's a concern, just from a basic human rights perspective. Okay. And this is the final one, is that I pay attention, but I haven't the slightest idea what's going on in the countries in which I work. I don't even know what's going on here. And which is why I work entirely collaboratively and have for decades now, because I work in Indonesia a lot. My Indonesian is perfect. I understand every word that's said, and I get about 25% of what people mean, because there are other things going on, and I am hopeless. I just never going to get there. So that's been. The other is that I have this model in my head that I can't shake, and I don't know that I should. I don't see any reason to shake it. And that's that, well, I'm not supposed to say this, humans are not profit maximizers. Yeah, but they are utility maximizers, and the utility that they want to maximize is often money, and they like to burn things, which is why the subspecies designation. Using this model and looking at the hard, real numbers on how much you can make from cutting forest down and putting in a cattle ranch, or putting in a soybean plantation, or putting in a timber plantation or oil palm, that really helps me to recognize what I'm up against. And I can talk about the value of tropical forest and the biodiversity and all these 24 or 300 species of migratory birds. Where's the money? If they're important, where's the money? And I keep waiting for it. We did all these willingness to pay studies, interview shoppers and parking in shopping malls in Iowa, and how much would you be willing to pay for orangutans? And they say, oh, $5, and then you multiply that by 300 million, and you get this huge number, and then the money's not coming through. So the developed world cares about conservation in the tropics. They care about the Amazon. Everybody cares about the Amazon, but where's the money? And I'm not seeing it competing particularly with the other land uses. But maybe the climate thing's going to work. Not only the global carbon sequestration, which isn't working in this country. We're pumping more oil. We want to frack everywhere. We're just increasing our emissions. Some states are trying to work against that, but the federal government is not with us on that. But climate, local climate matters. And the people that I talk to who are around areas that have been deforested complain about the heat. And, you know, this needs to get home. There are now data that show that forests, you don't need data, you know this, forests really air condition, you know, so they keep the area cool, the local area. Now, if I'm in Manaus and I get somebody from Sao Paulo whining about how it's getting hotter in Sao Paulo because you're cutting down the rainforest here, I'll go and tell them to back to Sao Paulo. But if I have to withstand 44-degree temperatures every day, and I never used to have to suffer more than 42, that's going to matter to me. And I think this is the kind of thing that we need to work on some more. And then, I don't know if you've talked about this, but all the larger scale effects of forests on not only regional but global patterns of rainfall, I find quite compelling. I want to get to what I do principally, which is called reduced impact logging, which isn't this. This is the opposite. This is what I'm trying to get away from. And, you know, so planning, skid trails, there are a lot of this. Some of the best logging I've ever seen is in the Amazon. Kawashi and the Tropical Forest Foundation, they have a great training center there. But the idea is that, and this slide is from Indonesia, but it's the same thing. This was a success on my part. I said it was a failure or not. It's successful in doing research that informs policy. So my research on reduced impact logging, how to harvest timber without lots of carbon emissions, I convinced, and others, mostly Indonesians with whom I work, convinced the Ministry of Forestry to require that concessions use reduced impact logging techniques, which reduces stand damage, increases worker safety, the profits go up, the carbon emissions go down, post-logging recovery rates increase, the increased financial viability, all these other benefits, blah, blah. Success as a researcher. And this is a theory of change of sorts, or a response pathway. But just take this one. The ministry requires reduced impact logging. The concessions accept that they need to do this, and they train their workers in reduced impact logging. You know, this is all the stuff that I've done. And then the hope for result is that the workers use it. Well, that sounds reasonable enough, but what are the assumptions? And just this arrow. And every one of those arrows in that theory of change that I showed before has this number of assumptions. One is that training was good. Second, the workers were appropriately trained, and that they learned what they were trained, and that they're convinced and motivated to use those practices. But if they're paid on a volume basis, and this takes longer, they're not going to do it. What about their productivity? That matters a lot. And here's a big one. We train workers in Kawashi, in Pará. Johan Swede and a bunch of gators have been doing training in reduced impact logging. Guys, you're training somebody to run a chainsaw, to fell trees properly, to get wood out of it. But the smart ones, how long do you think they remain cutting trees down? Well, it's the most dangerous profession in the world, according to the International Labor Organization. Either die or you get out of the business if you can. And they do. And so you're not getting those people. And then you're depending on supervision and audits and so forth. It's not working. Either the government, the Forest Stewardship Council isn't working, the government inspectors aren't working. And so as a result, this intervention of reduced impact logging, which we did the research that informed the policy was passed, but the problem was the policy levers in the government weren't connected to anything. You know, so all these things that she would say, well, duh, yeah, why didn't you think about the, you know, the actors and their motivations and their culture and where they're coming from and how they're paid and all that. If you're not thinking about that, you're not making these connections, it's not going to work. So I'm going to stop here, but my fundamental confusion now is that what should we expect the Amazon to look like? If we had our druthers, you know, some of us would have a big protected area. I mean, about 20 years ago, I was teaching tropical forestry, I remember, and I proposed, this is when I was 25 years ago, I was really getting into carbon offsets, and I did this calculation. Phil Fernside later did it better than I did, but I did a calculation of just how much carbon could be sequestered if we just protected the Amazon. So I put this out to the class, and I did the calculations, and I said, if we just kind of put a fence around the Amazon and leave it alone, we could sequester all the carbon we need to balance carbon emissions globally. And that was a brilliant idea, but it's, again, I led Brazilians into the class, and you know, they said, well, what about all the people? You know, people. God, yeah, it's from her students, right? What about all the people? And I said, well, give them green cards. Oh man, I barely made it out alive. But here I am telling the story. But so what is the landscape that we're expecting to see? It's not going to be pure preservation from horizon to horizon. And I'm confused because this pastoral landscape in Vermont, you know, is beautiful. Well, to me, to her, this is what she likes. She goes back to her farm in Maryland and looks out on this pastoral landscape and says, oh, this is lovely. It's all deforested. The forest animals have really suffered. There are tremendous edge effects and everything else, but this is okay. So, yeah, I mean, yeah, we decry Amazonian deforestation and degradation by bad logging and fire and stuff, but what do we really want there? And where? So that's the issue, and that's where the very local scale planting and intervention seems like the way forward. And actually, that's the conclusion that I came to after my year with USAID, was that you know, now they give their $400 million contract to a big Beltway bandit, a company that's going to implement it in a country in Indonesia, and they work with some local groups. But I think the money would be more effectively used to fund grassroots organizations at the tune of $50,000, $80,000 a piece, which would be a huge amount of money for them. You don't want to give them too much because that can do a lot of damage. And if they fail in the 2 years, give the money to somebody else, rather than giving it to Tetra Tech or Chemonix or DAI and have half the money stay in the US as overhead, another half of the half stay, you know, buying Fords and American flights and so forth. You know, get it there where people aren't suffering from the same sorts of ignorance that I suffered from in trying to understand what's going on in another country. So Marianne Moon admitted, but in the 36 years that we've been interacting, I have evolved some. I have a ways to go. I still have something of an attitude, but yeah, I have to look back and say, well, what I was doing didn't work. Now, I published a lot of papers and I got promoted and all that, but in terms of the conservation that I was trying to do, all the monitoring and evaluation and measurements and all that, you know, haven't been very effective.